Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. Our topic is Rewire Your Brain for Success, the Power of Mindfulness. I'm Lydia Sani, and I am one of the owners of Redwood Performance Group. And we're very excited about this topic and to be working with Meg. It's something near and dear to our hearts. We've actually done a fair bit on the learning side with mindfulness and resilience. So, very exciting topic for us. I'm going to introduce Meg. Meg Salter is an author, very accomplished author. She helps leaders bring positive change through executive coaching and mindfulness coaching. An integral master coach, Meg supports her clients in overcoming hidden barriers, building new capacities, and sustaining their desired change. She's also the author of Mind Your Life, How Mindfulness Can Build Resilience and Reveal Your Extraordinary. And it was actually the #1 new release on Amazon's business, health, and stress category this year, actually just recently in May. So very exciting. You can find the book on Amazon or chapters or with links to Meg's website, which we will put up at the end of this discussion so you'll be able to see it. We're also going to be giving out 3 books at the end of this webinar. So we're going to randomly choose 3 names of participants who are here, and you will get a book. So once we have information, Meg will sign the book and we'll get it off to you. So nice little perk for attending. Thank you. The objectives today, I'm just going to cover the objectives, and we're going to talk about the importance of mindfulness in today's hyper-connected world. We're going to look at what science tells about mindfulness and what it doesn't. We're going to look about how mindfulness is less about the and more about the dynamic awareness of whatever life throws at you, and life certainly does that. And we're going to look at real life stories of what mindfulness has done for others. And Meg's going to share some of her personal stories as well as other people's stories, which are all part of her book. And that'll be very interesting. And we're going to look at simple strategies to get you started that'll ultimately lead to remarkable results in your daily life. And Meg can attest to that because she's seen them on a personal front. So we're now going to start, we're going to do a little poll. We'd like to get a feel for who's in the audience and what your exposure to mindfulness is. So if you could answer that question, that would be great. We'll give it one more minute while you're filling this out. Yeah, I think we're good. So I'm going to introduce you to Meg and turn this over to her now, and Meg can comment on what she's seen so far.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Lydia, for the opportunity to be here. I'm delighted. Mindfulness is near and dear to my heart. I've been practicing for over 22 years personally, quite intensively, but while pursuing a professional career, while raising my children. So can attest to the fact that you can do this in the midst of a daily professional life, how it can augment your professional and personal life. So I've seen the transformations in myself and in many of my clients. Also, as an executive coach, trained integral master coach, I get really interested in how to help people create actual sustainable behavior change, because that's what mindfulness is. Practicing mindfulness is a behavior change. And also working with people to develop a practice that works for them. So I see that a number of folks have our exposure, they're kind of curious, we know a little bit about it, and a few of you have actually tried it. It's certainly becoming common in the lexicon, but it's kind of like a new word, so it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everybody. So let's talk now about why I think mindfulness is important. And I think we can let me just start off by saying, in some ways, this is a bit parallel to back in the 1960s or 70s, the only people who did physical training were athletes or military. People, you're going out for a run, someone would have said, well, who's chasing you? Now everyone knows they're supposed to train. And even if they don't, they feel guilty. So my view is that attentional training, which is what mindfulness is. Mindfulness is about training your attention and your intention, is at the same place now that physical training was in the 60s and 70s. And everybody will be doing it in, some years to come, one way or the other. So why is this important now? Well, first of all, any kind of natural downtime that we had is gone. 24/7 availability, hyperconnection. So the natural time for the rest and regeneration cycle, it used to be Sunday or Saturday or Friday, depending upon your religious background, that's gone. Our political world is recalibrating very, very quickly under our feet. So we have a high need to tolerate ambiguity, to live in a world of don't know, and to search for creative answers. Mindfulness can help with that. The 24/7 means we're also connected globally. We have clients and colleagues all over the world. If you're in banking or any kind of major supply chain area, you're dealing with people everywhere. So we need to be sensitive to different cultures. We need to be aware of our assumptions and learn to connect with different people who we may not naturally get or understand. And mindfulness can help with those kind of connections. In any kind of organization, we have multiple nodes of leadership. So knowing how you are when you walk into a room, the impact that you have, that's important. And self-awareness, therefore, becomes critical. I think most of the clients that I work with as an organizational consultant and as an executive coach feel that they're being asked to do too darn much by everybody's coming at them. So there are conflicting demands that we all have to deal with. It's not like you have one person telling you to do a series of things and nobody else coming at you. So we need to develop the ability to discern what's critical and what's not. And again, attentional focus can help you here. So to summarize on this slide, I would say that mindfulness can help build personal resilience. It can help create focus. It can help create connection with other people, and it can impact our stress levels and therefore our personal happiness and health. So what do we know about the science of mindfulness? So I'm going to start off with the science actually probably started off in the 1980s. We can go to the next slide. And that was started off with people like John Kabat-Zinn, who started mindfulness-based stress reduction, a very successful program. Started originally in hospitals with people who were close to palliative care. And he thought, what can I do to help people that's not religious, essentially? And that has, because it was an academic hospital setting, has spurred a whole huge explosion in the quantity and quality of scientific studies. Back in 1980, there were almost nothing. Now, in the year 2015 and later, we have almost 700, many of them peer-reviewed in high-level academic journals. So we're beginning to get some scientific data that verifies what people have been doing for many generations and many years. But in our society, we believe stuff that science tells us, so it kind of validates that. So what is the science telling us? It's telling us that mindfulness practice produces measurable structural and functional changes in the brain and physiological markers of stress. We can point to that. One of the main things that happens is that what I call in the book DAN, default attentional network, your natural mind wandering diminishes. You become aware of DAN. You become aware of the natural mind wandering, which tends to lead to a slightly unhappy state of mind. That's diminished. That means that your stress levels are down and your anxiety levels are less active. It also leads to cognitive control, being able to know what you're actually thinking. Most of us think, but we don't know what we're thinking. So being aware of what you're thinking and the ability, therefore, to question your thinking. Does this make sense? Am I really thinking? Does he really mean that when he or she said so and so? That's very helpful. And your general positive mood, what's called sort of a default marker set for mood, can be slightly enhanced. So you're not necessarily, if you're kind of born with a slightly pessimistic point of view, you're not necessarily totally stuck with that for the rest of your life. Mindfulness also produces positive effect on factors of physical well-being, which is why many people get started, because they're stressed out. So stress levels, physiological pain, negative mood, and anxiety are all positively affected. And lastly, and very importantly, And it seems kind of weird that something you kind of do by yourself, possibly sitting in a cross-legged position, would affect your relationships, but it does. And the book goes into why that might be, but certainly we know that it can foster empathy and enhance your relationships positively, both career and home. I mean, you sit down mindfully, that's going to affect your whole relationships. And with the type of people that we're always having to deal with, that's a huge plus. So there's now a polling question. Given this kind of data, does this raise any questions for you, both about the data or about the outcomes of mindfulness in general? These are open-ended questions, so just at your leisure, type in whatever would make sense for you. What questions are raised for you?
Anything you'd like answered or that comes to mind, and just listen to what Meg has said so far.
Or any questions that you wanted to ask anyway in this webinar, just get a chance to get it out now. Okay.
So how to practice mindfulness is a question, and how do you fit it in every day? That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. How often do you need to practice to see effects?
Is this like meditation?
Mm-hmm.
How to integrate with the corporate culture?
Yes. Well, we could probably do a webinar on each of these questions. So let me say first what we don't know about mindfulness. I considered Mind Your Life book to be part of a second generation series of what's coming out on mindfulness. So I am very aware of overselling. And as a consultant and coach, I try never to do that. So first of all, let me say what we don't know from the science. So the science is valid. It tells us that neuroplasticity and brain and body changes are real, but it doesn't tell us exactly how much, to your point about how much do we need to do. We can't prescribe it like a pill. It's not down to that level of precision. We don't know exactly what kind of mindfulness techniques to prescribe for what kind of situation. I mean, I think a very solid teacher and coach can do that, but that's not scientifically validated.
Would that be an individual thing as well?
Yes, it would. Absolutely. I personally, and part of the reason behind this book is that I think every mindfulness practice needs to be individually customized. With any particular person I'm coaching, it's never off the shelf. There's always a customization. Kind of like a personal trainer for the soul, if you will. I do train in groups, absolutely. I do train mindfulness in groups. And there's a group effect, as you have in any group effect. But just because you do something for a group doesn't mean when you go home and practice, you would do the same thing. The other thing that we don't know from the science, and any medical doctor will tell you this, is how to reliably foster behavior change. So whether that's sticking to the diet that you want to know, or the exercise plan that you want to know, how do you create reliable behavior change? It's not necessarily a medical, it's more a behavioral and a leadership issue, as we know.
Absolutely, and a lot of the training that we do, a lot of it does focus on behavior change. The individual has to embrace that behavior in order for any kind of training or new methodologies to work.
Right. So, Libby.
We're now going to jump to another poll, and what we're asking in this poll is, what does mindfulness mean to you? So if you could type in what it means to you.
And I will answer one of the questions, is mindfulness a kind of meditation? The short answer is yes, it is. But it does not necessarily have a religious orientation, although all mindfulness practices derive from centuries-old contemplative techniques that were often created in a religious environment. A mindfulness practice per se should not have a religious orientation per se. If you have a religious background, however, you can very easily integrate it into the theology of your choice. But that's typically not what we would do in a mindfulness training session. Okay, so people are saying things like pay attention in the present moment, aware of physical and emotional cues, being present, recognizing behaviors, creating self-awareness. Yes. Here's one, stopping the voice in your head. I will tell you right now that you don't really stop the voice in your head. You learn to deal with it differently and reframe it. um, absolutely.
It helps people, help someone notice what is going on internally and the impact on others, which is again the empathy thing, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's go over to the next slide. And I think because mindfulness has been around and talked about for 20 years and 5 to 10 years a lot, there can be some misconceptions. So that's why I start off with what mindfulness doesn't necessarily mean. Um, it can be pushed off in some in the field are calling it McMindfulness, as if, it was kind of like a pill that you could take in an instant, be happy. Um, so mindfulness does not necessarily mean that you're always going to feel calm or chill or whatever. The little, you notice I don't necessarily on my front cover have little balancing rocks. I have a process outlined in a sort of an origami thing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that when you sit down to meditate, you will automatically feel great at that time. You may, in fact, become aware of the storms you've been dealing with all day, but you're now aware of it. It doesn't necessarily mean sitting still in an uncomfortable or weird posture. To your point earlier, somebody saying, can you do this during the day? Mindfulness is training your attention, and your attention is with you, I'm going to say 18 hours out of 24, whenever you're awake. So you don't necessarily have to be sitting still to do this. A lot of people talk about not being judgmental. Well, judgmental doesn't mean you don't take a position in life. Of course you take a position. You're working, you take a position on something. The non-judgmental piece means you're not taking a position on what you are experiencing, your sensory experience. What you do as a result of that, absolutely you take a position. It doesn't mean that you just follow your breath. A lot of people, mindfulness-based stress reduction, following your breath or paying attention to the breath is one way of being present. The breath occurs in the present moment. If you're alive, you're breathing, so it's always there. So it is one practice, but not the only practice. And as we'll see later on, some of the stories we'll mention, it's not necessarily the best practice for everybody to go to. And as I said, and this is my counterintuitive, it doesn't necessarily mean you're always going to feel good. You're going to feel what's there. And if you're feeling great, you'll be aware of that. And if you're feeling stressed, you'll be aware of that. But the very fact that you're aware of your awareness is where the power comes in. So what does it mean then? That's our next slide. It does mean being fully a calm but very awake attention to all of what's going on. And this speaks to some of the points that were raised earlier. It's an awareness of what's happening in you physiologically, emotionally. That's the inner self-awareness what somebody was referring to. In a meeting, it could be being very aware of what's occurring around you, the body language, the subtle signals, the messages sent and not sent, to the sounds around you. So your notion of what is occurring now actually dynamically expands. It's like expanding your attentional bandwidth. You are literally aware of more, which is, you can see how many of us haven't been blindsided by something we didn't quite hear. It means a resilient ability to recover and adapt to what's going on, to stress. And in the book, I won't go into it in the webinar, but in the book I go into how some of the very capacities that are involved in resilience, such as being aware of your negative emotions, being able to focus under stress, those are capacities that mindfulness actually builds. So those two set of capacities overlap.
So it won't necessarily make a lot of the stress go away, but help you in how to deal with the stress.
It helps you in how to deal with stress. It helps you become aware of subliminal stress you're not necessarily aware of. It builds in a natural recovery and rest time, which we all need. And it gives you strategies for keeping stress, I would say, in the background of your attention, not the foreground of your attention. It helps you become aware of your attention as something that you can consciously direct rather than being yanked around. And we'll go into that in some of the practices later on. Um, it, Mindfulness is something, because it's learning how to direct your attention. Later on I say it's like directing a cue ball into the right pocket. Where do you want it to go? You can practice anywhere, anytime. Now, initially, not necessarily, because like anything else, you have to practice to get good at it. But once a reasonable level of skill is developed, and mindful awareness is developing a skill, you should be able to practice anywhere, anytime. So that speaks to somebody talking about integrating it into your life. And part of what I do with coaching is helping people design a strategy to do that into your life and your schedule. Because you're more resilient, because you're more awake, I find for myself and many of my clients that you're actively more engaged in your life. It's not about, yes, you might take 10, 15, 20 minutes away from your schedule to do the practice, but the rest of your life, you're more actively present and actively engaged. So there's more of you there. There are, in fact, many, many ways to pay attention. Mindfulness is all about sensory awareness, moment-by-moment awareness. But you can be aware of your body, you can be aware of your emotions, you can be aware of the talking voice in your head. My sister calls it a committee. There's so many voices in there. You can be aware of where the emotion is in your body. That's a very powerful practice. So there are lots and lots of ways of practicing. If someone said to you, do you do exercise? They would say yes, but they could be doing a whole variety of physical exercises, right? They could be doing weight training or stretch or cardio or whatever. The same thing for mindfulness. There are a great variety of practices, and finding one that works for you is the key to maintaining it and getting it going. And lastly, and here's my counterintuitive, it doesn't necessarily feel better the first time you sit down. You know, you're training your brain. The brain might squeak back at you. When you first go to do a stretch class or an exercise class, you might walk out thinking, oh man, I ache everywhere. But after a week or two, you're feeling good. So just because it doesn't feel great the first time doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Let's go over. So let me tell you about some real life stories. In the book, I wanted to interview people who I consider to be positive role models, people who maintained a mindfulness practice for at least 3 years. Some of what the data is telling us is that, say, for example, people who do take a training course, they invest a significant amount of time and money in, say, a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. 6 months to a year later, only 1 in 10 are practicing. So the take-up rate is tough. You're rewiring your brain. Your brain may have something to say about that. So I wanted to interview people who had been able to keep at it for some period of time. The minimum cutoff was 3 years. There are 18 such stories in the book. Some people have been at it for 40 years. So lifelong practitioners. So asking them things like, why did you start? And how did you keep it up? And what was the impact on your life? Those are the kind of stories that you'll find in the book. So I wanted to talk about several of those individual real life stories. One is Barbara, who had to navigate a critical lawsuit and business setback. So Barbara ran a health-based organization. She was the CEO of this organization. In the story, we talk about how one of her employees left and took a lot of the intellectual property and customer base with them. So she was fighting to retain her business. And because the employees also had a share in the business, she was fighting to retain the well-being of her employees. So Barbara's situation was initiated by a huge situation. So she went in, by her own admission, in the deep end. So she was advised, if you're going to come through this unscathed, you need to do something that will, not overrail you with stress. So she went in, she took training, she was sitting downstairs in her basement trying to calm her mind for 30, 40 minutes, an hour a day. Barbara's also, by her own admission, pretty high on the attention deficit disorder scale. And what she would say is I would never start off with breath practice. For someone like me, and here's the whole customization piece, for someone like me, who's very hyper, a very active person, I would start off with something in daily life. I would start off with washing my hands and paying attention to the feeling of washing my hands. For her, something sitting still for 15 minutes was advanced practice. She needed to start off in motion. And she did make it through the lawsuit. One of the things that touched me most was she said, I never ended up hating. I never ended up having negative feelings in me. I got us through. I was able to navigate the business back to profitability. I was able to protect the employees' interests, and I didn't carry that bitterness inside me. So that's a beautiful story.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Um, so Barbara would have been in her 50s, let's say. Laura, by contrast, would be in her late 20s, and she was sort of based in the Toronto area. Barbara was US based. Laura would have been late 20s, had been to teachers college, couldn't find a job as a teacher. Anybody who is in the Toronto area or Southern Ontario knows how easy it is to get a job at the Toronto District School Board. So she was back to contract work, which was barely paying the rent. And she kind of regressed. We all do under stress. Anybody in leadership development knows that if we're under stress, we can tend to regress to our bad old self. So she was kind of tending to regressing to some negative behaviors, body behaviors, and so forth. And so she found, for the interesting thing about Laura is what really helped her, in contrast to Barbara, who went to her basement and powered on through, Laura found a group. She found a group of people who were also practicing. She would go once a week, and after several months, she started to practice on her own. So for some people, the group support is essential. Some of us are groupies, and some of us are solo types. So Laura, in fact, after a couple of years, is now getting steady work as a teacher and is loving it, and also teaches mindfulness to her kids. And as we've seen some of that, don't give the kids a detention. Sit down and watch your belly rising and falling with the breath. So Laura's now steadily practicing.
Interesting.
Yeah. James is a different kind of story. James, actually, I'll give you his full name because he's just recently published a book. Dr. James Maskalik, his most recent book is called Life on the Ground Floor. He's an emergency doctor at St. Mike's Hospital. And shortly after graduating med school, he went off with Doctors Without Borders, working in Sudan. And his first book was about that, essentially turning this brand new thing called a blog, in those days blogs were brand new, into a book. And so James relates how when he went back for his second posting, I believe Sudan or Somalia, I'm not sure which, when he walked out with essentially what's called vicarious trauma. Watching people being murdered, trying to deal with patients and having virtually no equipment. What's called in the helping professions compassion fatigue. So he had been exposed to it as a young guy and tried a little bit, but if you're in residency in med school, there was no time for breathing, let alone meditation. So he went back knowing he had to cope differently. He cared passionately about helping people, about going overseas, but he had to cope differently. So he would do a bit of yoga and a bit of meditation in the morning, he said, before it got too hot. And now James will say, I will do 30 seconds, 1 minute, as I'm walking down the hall and I know I'm going to have a difficult conversation with a client or with the patient's family, he'll practice. So for James, he will say things like, I have not been burnt out in my field, and many are. In emergency medicine, many are burned out, and he's able not to be burned out.
I believe emergency medicine has one of the highest rates of burnout.
Absolutely, he does. And the fact that he's there and choosing to be there, and in fact, as he describes in his book, From the Ground Up, he's actually helping set up the first ever emergency medicine practice in Ethiopia, which is a brand new concept there. So he's able to carry out his life's passion and not fry. So that's amazing.
That's incredible.
And myself actually, it started off, and I think this is in the first chapter of the book. This was a number 22 years ago, and I've got my young kids at that time. They're school-age children, and the mortgage is paid off, the marriage is pretty good, the kids are doing okay. Looking back, I felt I was kind of skating on the surface of life, and I was coping how I tend to cope, which is kind of, in my case, lean in a lot and button up the feelings. Unfortunately, around that time, there was a suicide in my family. My younger brother shot himself. And maybe 6 to 8 weeks after that, I found a little voice in my head said, Meg, you should meditate, or you could end up like John. And it's like, I'm an MBA, I'm a coach, I'm a consultant. I don't hear voices in my head. This is not schizophrenia. This is a deeper part of me saying you need to get real. You need to deal with what's going on. You know, people in trauma or in resilience who say we all cope, sorta. We have an adequate way of coping, but we don't necessarily go to the bottom. So this was my call to go to the bottom. And I started off with mindfulness-based stress reduction because that's all that was available in those days. And I followed the breath, and I hated it. Actually, I hated it. I felt like pins and needles all over my whole body. It's like, ugh, why am I doing this? But I stuck with it, and probably because of the depth of the calling in myself. And I've tried all different kinds of practices, and in the book I go over the different kinds of practices that I've done. And now work intensively with a sort of a unified mindfulness framework, which is a very robust approach to mindfulness training. So what I wanted to do with the stories is basically give people a sense of, you know, real people do this, and it makes a real life impact. And it can be done by anybody. So maybe there is a bit of a poll question here.
And before we go to the poll question, someone's actually asking how did Barbara sustain her practice? But I guess you answered that.
Yes, Barbara. Yeah. So yes, Barbara did sustain her practice. I mean, her own natural type is you know, she could have taught Sheryl Sandberg. She's a lean-in type for sure. So she powered on through. And I think she had, some people start because they have a very strong calling. There is some kind of stuff happening in their lives. They feel they have to do something differently. And so this was her case. So she did power on through. She has since adjusted her mode of practice. So she does different types of practice than she did initially. And in fact, she's now teaching. She took mindfulness-based stress reduction training and is teaching others. But she has expanded her modus operandi beyond the initial one. And people are saying, I keep trying, falling in and falling out, falling in and falling out. Well, you know, that's how it goes. That's how it goes. One of the things you learn in mindfulness is paying attention, and you realize that your mind is not trainable. It's, you know, the people from Far Asia call it monkey mind. I liken it to my kids' gerbils or hamsters. And that is the training. That is the training, is to select a focus of attention. It could be the breath, it could be your body, it could be something you listen to, and your mind will fall off, and you bring it back. Every time you bring it back, you can think of that like a repetition in weight training. So you will try and you will fall off. The key thing is, don't beat yourself up. Be nice to yourself. Think of it like a puppy, you know. Well, you try again, right? You're training your mind. So if you recognize that you will try and fall off and try and fall off and try and fall off, it's not like you're drinking or something, right? This is just your mind you're dealing with, and start again. And it's that simple, but simple isn't necessarily easy.
It's discipline as well, isn't it?
It's discipline. You are building a discipline, and like any discipline at first, it feels awkward. In the book, I call it a J curve. And, you know, there's learning how to navigate that J curve, learning how to navigate the initial awkwardness. If you know that it might feel awkward at first, and that's normal, then you'll be easier on yourself. So don't get sucked in by people who are like, have a perfect body, because none of us do, and are totally blissful. Don't get sucked in by that. It might feel a little awkward at first. That's normal. Did any of these stories resonate with you?
So we're going to go to the poll now, and you can answer which of these stories resonated with you the most. So it looks like James and you are tied for stories.
Part of the reason is because perhaps not everybody's going to have to deal with a lawsuit. And of course, I can talk about my own experience very personally. So let me start off with I think that there is one of the things that I try and do in Mind Your Life is help people anchor their motivation, because like any behavioral change, why you're doing it is important. And if it does feel awkward in the first few minutes, you've got to remember that, oh yeah, this is why I'm doing it, right? If it's an important reason, you're more likely to stick through it. So for all of the individuals there, they found some reason to say it was important. So for myself, obviously, with the suicide of my brother, it was shattering for everybody, um, and so that sort of probably rewired me at a level I didn't even know about. But I mean, it doesn't have to be that bad, right? And for most people, it isn't that bad. Um, um, so it could be sort of a mild dissatisfaction. It could be, in some people, it's like they go to a new job and, what used to work for them is no longer working for them, or all of a sudden they've got a job and they've got kids and their downtime has disappeared. So finding a way to anchor your motivation is really important, and there's a worksheet for that in the book. But it's like any behavior change. There's a reason for it. And, those of you who are in learning and development, why are you here? What do you want to accomplish? Those are sort of standard questions. I wonder if we could go back to, are there some of the earlier questions that came in about what people want to find out about before we go to the actual practices? Because we've got lots of time. Right. Yeah, so how to practice mindfulness. Those are some of the questions that came up initially. I'll give you some ideas in the next few minutes around it. In the workplace, lots of opportunities to practice in the workplace. I certainly make it personal in the book. I have practiced mindfulness in a toilet stall when I am really worried about the meeting that's coming up and taking a few minute breathers. All the time when I'm working with clients, I'll practice a very active, deep listening, so I'm totally present with my client. I'm not listening to what my repartee is. I'm very, very present with the client. There's always minutes of downtime as you're walking down the hall, as you're waiting for your computer to reload. So there's lots of moments in the day that you can use downtime or stress time to actually turn it around. Is there a situation where you recognize you need to put mindfulness into practice? I would just say your stress levels are a pretty good indicator. Some people, it's their physiological health. There are some stories in the book where it's cancer survivors, and they recognize they need to develop this in a different kind of way. How to integrate with corporate culture. I think of this as a capacity building exercise and leadership development. And I think the demands on all of us as leaders, and a leader is anybody who influences somebody else, so not necessarily a corporate role. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the demands on all of us are higher, and therefore our mental, cognitive, and emotional intelligence capacities need to be higher. So it's kind of like what used to work doesn't necessarily work anymore. So that can be a signal for how you need to put it into practice. How often do you need to practice to see effects? Again, the book goes over that. It does vary. I think I recommend people start off with 10 minutes a day minimum and then add in what I call practice in life. And you can, if you know how to practice smart during life, you can be at 30 minutes a day quite quickly. And you should be seeing results within a couple of months at the most. But part of the months thing is how long it takes to change the brain and how long it takes to establish an actual practice. So, but again, there's not a precision like that. It's not like it's a pill and you can see, 30 seconds with, when you take your Tylenol. So it is variable and you need to cut yourself some slack. So let's go into some things that you can do, and I will do some sort of talking about this. If you want to follow along a little bit during the time, that's great. And all of these are things that you can do regularly and during the day if you wish. The 30-second pause is taught by the mindfulness best stress reduction people. In all of these slides, you'll see two keywords: direct attention. So the fact that you can actually direct your attention rather than have it being reactive is the key mental muscle involved, being able to direct your attention where you want it to go, when you want it to go, is at the high capacity what you're capable of. So I think it like, placing the cue, the billiard ball in a certain cue pocket. That's the kind of, ultimately the kind of precision and stability you're able to acquire. Of course, it's not like that initially. Most of us at work are in our heads, so the ability to pay direct attention to somewhere in the body is essential. So you can take a pause during the day, either in a meeting, when you're not actually actively talking. You can take a pause while your computer is loading up. You can take a pause in between tasks and just direct your attention somewhere in the body. I'm doing it right now. So I'm feeling the buttocks on the chair. I'm naturally straightening my back. I'm paying a little bit of attention to the breath. I'm aware of this feeling of the voice, larynx kind of resonating. So I'm out of my head. Most of us get paid to be in our heads unless we're athletes. So getting out of your head is a restful act. You're developing that attentional directive muscle, and you're taking a mini micro pause. And most of us don't do that for ourselves. We're kind of caught up in what's next, what's next. So see if you can do that for a minute. Right now, you're at work, and just think of your mind like a billiard cue and direct it somewhere in the body, somewhere where you can tactilely feel. It could be the feeling of your palms, it could be the feeling of your feet, the chair, the breath, and just get curious. That's the second muscle. Directing your attention builds the skill of concentration. That's one of the core skills of mindfulness. Getting curious. What else are you seeing? Oh, my back is sore. Maybe I'll adjust the posture of my back a little bit. That builds the skill of sensory clarity, the second key skill of mindfulness. And don't judge what you're feeling. Don't judge yourself for the fact that you can't feel much. That builds the skill of equanimity, which is an open acceptance, a radical acceptance, as Tara Brach would say, to whatever it is that sensory experience is bringing your way. Okay, so here's another practice. You can see my voice is lowering automatically. Here's another practice, and I call this deep listening. So many of you who are in the corporate world or have done leadership development work are familiar with active listening. Deep listening takes active listening to a whole new level. So it's active listening on steroids. So here, again, we're directing our attention, and it's in the body, but you're putting it basically inside your head. So place the cue ball inside your head at your ears. And you can be aware of what it is you're actually hearing. So you're directing all of your attentional faculties to what you're hearing. This is a fabulous exercise to do in nature, where you might like what you're hearing. If you really want to push yourself, you can do it when there's a jackhammer down the road, and be aware of what you're hearing, even though you don't like what it is you're hearing. That builds the equanimity. It's a fabulous practice to do during a meeting. What are you actually hearing? Paying attention to that, paying attention to the nuances in the voice, the volume, paying attention to the gaps in the sound. You can do this right now to the sound of my voice. If there's something else in your environment, you can also hear that. So you get curious about everything it is that you're hearing. You get curious about the pauses, the silences in between the sound. You don't, if you're feeling rumbly in the stomach, or you think you need time for a bio break, you direct your attention, in this case, away from those physiological sensations into what it is you're hearing. If you're finding yourself irritated because the person you're listening to you think is a jerk, or he's been going on for far too long, You will let that emotional upset be in the background of your attention and direct the foreground of your attention to what it is you're actually hearing. So you're not cutting the person off in mid-sentence. You're hearing them through. So that's a practice of deep listening. One of the things that I love to do, and this is great, and in fact, one of my teaching colleagues has done this with teenagers, and particularly with kids at risk in inner city schools. And he calls it mind the music. And that's taking this active, deep listening skill to while you're listening to your favorite music. So if you're listening to, musicians probably do this all the time, only they don't necessarily call it that. So if you're listening to something, you can pay attention to only the music, letting other things be in the background. You can pay attention to which particular instruments do you want to follow in the music. That's getting really deep into the clarity piece. You can pay attention to the background, the boo-wop singers. Are you hearing them versus the foreground? You can pay attention to how this makes you feel in the body, your emotional reaction to it. If you love the music, where is that pleasure arising in the body? If you dislike the music, where is that disgust arising in the body? So you become familiar with the emotional reactions that are arising. So this is you can do this walking to work or on the subway. So there are lots of ways of, these are all what I call practice in life kinds of suggestions, things that you can do during your daily life. For that person who wanted to ask about integration, you can certainly do them sitting. So if you understand that mindfulness is about cultivating your capacities for attention and your capacities for intention, where and how you want to direct that, you get a very broad brush understanding of what's involved. So those are some key practices. I think we've got about 5 or 10 minutes left for open kinds of questions. So let's open it up to the floor. Did you want to say anything now? People want to leave early, or?
We're going to be asking questions and leaving some time. If you want to leave early and want a copy of this recording, we're happy to email it to you. Just let me know, and we'll make the recording available later today. So also, if you want to hear from Meg, you can either, we'll put up her information at the end once we've answered questions, and or you can go to her website as well and sign up to be part of her blog. We think thank you very much, Meg. This has been very insightful, very inspiring, and you've certainly done a wonderful, wonderful job with your book and with your whole mindset. It's been remarkable. So, do we have any further questions?
One says, you mentioned unified mindfulness framework. Yes, this is what I go to into in excruciating detail in the book. I've been working extensively with a meditation master called Shinzen Young, who has a very robust, all-encompassing framework for mindfulness meditation, and this book helps to translate his brilliant but impenetrable language into what I consider to be accessible prose. So it basically gives you lots and lots and lots of different ways to practice. And I think, again, that's the key, is to finding a custom fit, something that works for you. Some people love working with the breath. It's just sort of a natural. Some people hate it. Some people like paying attention to the body. Some people hate it. Some people have want to be more in tune with their emotional capacities, their emotional intelligence. Other people aren't interested. Some people just want to be left alone and 20 minutes in their room. Please leave me alone. That was more like me. Some people do better when they're in a group. So it's finding ways to make this work for you that I think the Unified Mindfulness Framework really is really very helpful with. So I think that's probably, without getting into too much detail more, is what I can say about that. If you wanted to take it more deeply, we can do a one-on-one or look at the website. I welcome any other questions, theoretical or practical or crazy, especially the crazy ones. Do I teach mindfulness? I'm segueing my practice from, I have a strong background in organizational consulting and change management. I've always included executive coaching as part of that. I also do mindfulness coaching. Sometimes the mindfulness coaching is incorporated as part of executive training for those people who want it, but not everybody does. But I will say every executive I have worked with, every leader I have worked with benefits from greater self-awareness. And because they need to know what effect they have when they turn up in a room. They need to know what effect they have on people. So that's essential. Um, some people, yes, can I talk about an ad hoc basis? Um, yes, I liken mindfulness training to physical training. At first, you need to do physical training in a planned kind of way, so you actually have muscles you can work out, right? So you do need to go to the gym or in your own or do some regular exercise just so that you have those stronger physical muscles. When those stronger physical muscles are there, you can do effortlessly what used to totally degrade you, right? You can climb up and down 20 sets of stairs, where one set of stairs used to slay you. So there's a place for planned practice. But once those attentional muscles are stronger, they kick in automatically without you even knowing. That's the beauty of it. Your attentional muscles are stronger. Once you have a certain base level of awareness, you can realize, oh my gosh, I'm in a difficult meeting. I better do X, Y, Z. I better practice my deep listening. I better give myself 30 seconds of grounding before I open my big mouth. So the beauty of it is the ad hoc practice, but you need to have some baseline for the ad hoc to be possible. And I think finding that right balance between planned and ad hoc is part of keeping going. The beauty of it is the ad hoc, but you do need a little bit of the planned stuff so that the ad hoc is actually capable of doing it. Somebody asked if my own practice early on, what occurred that you noticed was working. I think this is a big thing in mindfulness meditation, is that often the benefits come from what is not there. It's like the absence of a negative more than the presence of a positive. And this is why it can be hard to keep going. So in my case, and I talk about this in the book, we also went through a period of a major relocation. We moved cities, in this case from Montreal to Toronto. We thought it would be a corporate move. It wasn't. We did it on ourselves. I was stressed beyond belief. And I was basically less of a bitch, actually.
I can't see you ever being a douchebag.
I was not nagging my husband. You have that corporate transfer yet? I realized he's doing his best and they're not giving it. We're going to have to do this on our own. So I was able to sustain a level of ambiguity and uncertainty that I could not have. So for me, that's when I first noticed is that I'm not bugging him quite as much. And the level of uncertainty and the ability to keep my cool when I had no idea what was going to happen. And again, here's the big thing. It's not necessarily like you're going to feel this huge, big buzz and thrill of wonderful. You might, lucky you. But it might be more, oh, I'm a little less fill in the blank, whatever the negative is. I'm a little less stressed. I'm a little less impatient. I'm a little less worried. My stomach is a little less in churn. So noticing the negatives that are not there, I liken it to looking in the rearview mirror. You got to look in the rearview mirror occasionally and notice that big truck isn't following me anymore. Oh yeah, it's working. So it is subtle. And keeping your mind and your attention out for those subtle cues as to what's not there should be part of your practice. You should be checking every once in a while what's not there, because it's not going to announce itself to you, which is why habit formation can be a little awkward in mindfulness meditation, because it's not like you get the instant zing of chocolate, for example, or a beautiful sunset. You have to look out for it. How are we doing for time? Do we have time for one or two more?
We can probably have time for one more, and then we'll announce the 3 winners of the book.
How can they manage the stress and focus on their immediate responsibilities without feeling like they're being selfish and ignoring the world? For people who have a strong connection to other people, I would go back to someone like James's story. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of other people.
Very true.
So the compassionate burnout, my daughter's a social worker, anybody in the helping professions, burnout is a well-known phenomenon. So taking time for yourself, this is a mental reframing, so that you can be fully there for other people, so that you can know when to help, so that you can know when not to help. When are they better off doing it on their own, being able to discern that. So that's part of your motivation piece, really, uh, as to why you're doing it, that you are connected to other people, but you are part of that group, and you being the best you can be in that group will be positive. So I hope that's helpful, and there are a number of people who find that who are either in a caring profession or they're just naturally a caring kind of person. They find that they place less demands on themselves, less unrealistic demands, and they know where and when to focus their caring capacities. Yes.
So we're going to, oh, I see a comment from Anne Godfrey. So basically, the vibrancy of colors in the world, the blue
Yes.
sky. So I guess that's another
Yes.
tactic as well,
Yeah,
right?
certainly the
Music, colors.
sensory clarity,
Mhm.
noticing the vibrancy of colors, noticing the vibrancy of sound and music indicates to you that the sensory clarity skill is coming online. And part of how you notice that is just the world looks sharper and clearer and less fuzzy. I mean, it's not a different world. Trust me, it's the same world. But that's one way of noticing feedback, that the sensory clarity skill is coming online. And for some people, that's the first thing that they notice.
Great. We are going to put up Meg's website so that you can see it. And so we're going to have that information there for you. Feel free to reach out if you'd like to. And we're also announcing our three winners. So they are Jennifer Moffat, Anne Godfrey, and Vivian Cheng. So I have your emails here. I will reach out to you and we can coordinate the best way to get a hold of you. We'll have Meg sign your books as well. So we do want to thank you. If anyone wants to stay behind and ask a few more questions, you're more than welcome to. This wraps up our presentation for today, and we thank you so much for your excitement, your questions, your enthusiasm. Meg has been wonderful and very, very successful webinar. Thank you so much, Meg.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I so appreciate it. And try it out. You might like it. I will stay on the line for anybody who has some more questions.
Great. So we're seeing lots of thank yous. Yes, definitely. Every small step does make a very big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Those of you who are still there, I would say this is a journey of a million steps. So just keep on trucking. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day. If you, again, have any questions, feel free to reach out to Meg or to me, Lydia Sani, at redwoodperforms.com, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.